Hello, I'm Jane Turner, and I would like to share with you my latest picture book written by Margaret Wilde. It's called Girl from the Sea, and it's the second time I've collaborated with Margaret. The first time was in 1984, a long while between books for us, and that was with There's a Sea in My Bedroom, another book about the sea. This book was Margaret's first manuscript and my first illustrations. Both of us were just beginners in 1984, and here we are years later coming back to working together, and it's such a joy to be illustrating a text for Margaret. She's a wonderful storyteller. She has the visual literacy to know when to leave spaces for the pictures. A picture book is a perfect balance between words and pictures, and she never prescribes how we as illustrators are to interpret her words. She gives us the manuscript and she says, just do what you like with this and we'll get back when you finish and discuss it at the end. So you can see for the manuscript there were changes made. After I'd actually made the first couple of storyboards, I asked her if she could take out one or two characters because I couldn't see their place in my drawings and they didn't seem to be essential. And she was very kind about it. And she said, if that's what you need, and left me to it. And then this is one of the dummies that I made. About this stage, and I feel that the dummy is the right size, that the images are flowing reasonably well, what I do is take it into my publisher, who sits with me and we discuss together the flow of the pictures, and when we feel that it's working well enough to share with Margaret, then it becomes something that we pass backwards and forwards between the three of us. For the end papers, which were originally just going to be a tinted colour, I decided to work on learning how to do Japanese marbling. So these are examples of some of the experiments that I made. They don't dominate the book, they're just a mood setter. To do it, I needed to have a tub of water and some droplets of water-soluble ink, which when you actually drop them into the water, they just move delicately into ripples. And using rice paper, which is very transparent as well. Because if you're working with a ghost image, leading into the end papers with something this subtle might create a mood that we could follow through the rest of the book. You can see a great difference between the cover on the dummy and the cover on the finished book. That's because as we transitioned through the pictures, the book took on a life of its own, and therefore even the title became changed. This book, I felt from the beginning, from the cover through the end papers, through to the title pages, and right back to the finished book, needs to have the mood set by about water and about something mysterious. And it began with a question: who lives in that cabin by the sea? I spy a mum and a dad, a boy and a girl, who lives in that cabin by the sea. And it goes on to say, I wish it was me. One could almost have thought that it was for a young reader, but the concept was much too complex for a young reader. And there were very poetic, abstract sentences for people who would understand symbolism and metaphor. So I wondered how I was going to, what age group could it be for? I was really not sure about it until I imagined the child to be young enough to play I Spy, would perhaps be using some of these sentences, the repetitive questioning of a child, and so I could make my little character much younger than originally I planned to. The reader who's much older will be able to identify that it's a little child's needs being talked about, but it's still a complex and quite grown-up storyline. It was up to me to actually think about who should be the most important, because in the story it just says, I spy a mum and a dad, a boy and a girl. There's no particular emphasis on any one of those characters. The mother might be the one who needed to be yearning as much as the child. So the child is yearning for a family, but maybe the mother is yearning for some need There are times when she seems distant and separate, and the father is the nurturing figure, and he's taking care of the children. So I thought the mother could be enduring some great sadness. There was a little grave in the foreground. Now that little grave could be the grave of the ghost child from 100 years ago, but it could also be some personal loss that the mother's had, and she's suffering grief. And because she is, she's also more vulnerable to perhaps being open to this spiritual experience that the rest of the family are not quite so focused on. Do you feel me curling around you soft as mist? That already creates such an image. There's so much room to actually create a feeling. Probably my favourite lines in the story. I started to look for techniques. I wasn't sure how to draw this book, but because there's a lot of mood and mist and rain, I chose charcoal. Charcoal being smudgy and soft, there are lots of times when I could create atmosphere with that detail. And using white light, sometimes coming through the darkness, or the charcoal becoming the darkest dark when it was night time. I felt that the contrast between dark and light was also symbolic. And so even after I found my model, and at the right age, who was able to pose for me, I was experimenting with how to make her ethereal and slightly transparent, and yet be recognisable as a child. And lots of torn drawings, and many months where I failed and had to start again. And in the end I came up with the idea that part of her hands or her face, would be quite able to be seen, but the rest would just dissolve. To get the parents and the other figures to stand out and still keep the little girl ethereal, I chose to use the colours of the sea, where she was touched by the ocean that she brought with her. And that meant that with black and white strong pictures, we had a focal point of sea colours. That way I could have them both on the page at the same time. There are many thick layers to this dummy because every time I came up with an idea, I pushed it further and further, trying to make a much more, not only dramatic series of drawings, but also a bit like music, something that flowed from big moments to small moments, to stillness, to surprise. So to do that, first I had to feel the story, and then I had to find ways of composing the different drawings so that they gave you that feeling. So these ones that came close to the finished artwork were after many, many efforts. And some of them, even then, did not work. I decided to knock back the idea of seeing her face close up too soon, and instead, even though I'd made the artwork, I made this picture which was about the little girl just being, again, a half-formed ghost-like figure in the night air, floating. So I think it's important to know that even though you might put months into putting your ideas down as roughs, you can still improve them if you're brave enough and you're prepared to redo something that might work as a drawing but doesn't work in the context of the storytelling. At the end of this story, I had a choice of how to finish it, and it seemed to me that first of all I needed to trust my audience to be able to make ideas for themselves. And so I could have tied it up tightly with a big explanation and a big moment, but instead I left it for the reader to decide for themselves whether the child was asked in or not. And if you look closely at the second last picture, there's a clue to the relationship between the child, the mother, and the mother's relationship to her other children. And it's left for you to interpret and resolve for yourself. But I do hope that it finishes on a high, that it finishes with some happiness and some resolution in the final part of the story. Otherwise, why would I do it? I hope you've enjoyed listening to the process that I go through to make a picture book. And I hope that in reading this book, you make up your own mind about whether you think this is a sad book about ghosts or something much more abstract and perhaps meaningful than that for you. Thank you.